Okay, once again, welcome to our webinar this afternoon, Creating a Culture that Leads to Excellence. My name is Chris Seifert. I'm a partner with Wilson Perumal and Company. We are a strategy and operations consulting firm that helps companies compete and execute better in complex environments. Our presentation today, we're going to talk about culture, why it is becoming more important for organizations to work on culture, what kind of culture thrives and leads to excellence in performance. Specifically, we'll look at an organization in the U.S. Navy that has created a culture that has led to excellence. And then we'll give you guys some very specific strategies and steps that you can take to create a similar culture that leads to excellence within your own organization and your own team. And these should be some pretty practical steps that I think you can apply with any team size, whether it's 10 people or 10,000 people. The steps will remain the same. And if you stay till the end, we'll talk about a specific tool that we've used and that we'll offer you some access to if you'd like to give it a try. So without any further ado, let me go ahead and begin our presentation. So let me start by saying I think, the formula for winning at business isn't really all that complicated, right? It requires that you have a great strategy. It requires that you execute that strategy well. And, if you do both of those things, then you're going to have great performance. And, when we talk about strategy, that can be something, people use that word for a lot of different things. When we use the term strategy, we talk about making decisions about how to allocate scarce resources. So it's what products do you sell? What markets do you sell them to? How do you distribute them? What's the price point, the level of service? Who do you partner with? How do you organize in order to deliver that offering? And so obviously, you have to make great decisions about all of those things. But then, if we make great decisions, but we don't execute very well, and we don't execute those decisions well, then we're not going to have a good performance either. But if we do both of those things, then we'll see great safety performance, environmental performance, regulatory compliance, quality, productivity, yield, cost, all those operational measures that we want to achieve. So, while this formula isn't very complicated, it for many organizations seems that it's getting harder and harder to win, right? So if we know what it takes, why is it getting more and more challenging? And at Wilson Perumal and Company, we'd say that one of the leading reasons is complexity. That the complexity that most of our organizations are operating in or having to deal with has grown dramatically over the last 20 or 30 years. And if you think about where's that complexity coming from? Well, it's coming in the forms of new technology. Things that we're trying to do that 20, 30 years ago people wouldn't have imagined we're trying to do, and the pace of change in technology is only accelerating. Complexity also comes from products and services. Customers are demanding more customization of products and services, and so we see a lot of product and service portfolios expanding very rapidly. Consequently, the processes to deliver these products and services are becoming more complex. The organizations that deliver these processes and support these processes is becoming more complex. We increasingly see, matrixed organizations, which just didn't exist 20, 30 years ago, and organizations where there's committees reporting to committees. Markets are more complex, both in terms of geographic region. Globalization is becoming, more and more prominent, and then even, markets like financial markets are becoming more and more complex to navigate and understand. Regulations. The government increasingly every year adds new regulations and very rarely deletes any of them. And then finally, communications. The average manager receives something on the order of 150 emails a day. You throw on top of that social media, the 24-hour news cycle, and just all the data and information that confronts us on a daily basis, and it can be quite overwhelming. And the reality is 20, 30 years ago, that just didn't exist. So the challenge for all of us is that this all these variables are interacting with each other, and so the rate at which complexity is growing is exponential. If you think about the difference between complexity and complicated, complicated means that a system has a lot of pieces, a lot of parts. But in a complex, but complexity is really lies in the interactions between those parts. So if I have a system with two things, there's only one potential interaction. If I have a system with five things, well, now there's 10 potential interactions. A system with 10 things has 45 potential interactions. And so as these numbers of interactions grow, or I'm sorry, as the number of pieces in the system grow, you can see that the complexity, those numbers of interactions, grow at an exponential rate. Consequently, more and more of our organizations are behaving like complex systems. And complex systems have some very different characteristics than simple systems. So, if you think of this flock of birds as an example, it has very different characteristics than simple systems. Complex systems have nonlinear reactions. So A doesn't always interact with B, then C, then D. They may interact in different orders. There are feedback loops. So a small change can grow very rapidly. The classic example is the butterfly flapping its wings off the coast of Africa, resulting in a hurricane on the Atlantic coast. Similarly, complex systems have unknown interactions. Frankly, there's just so many interactions that we can't count them all. And finally, they have emerging properties. They evolve and change in ways that we didn't anticipate or didn't intend them to. And so if you think about the organization as that flock of birds, companies look more and more like that, right? There's no bird in that flock that is controlling the flock. There's no bird that even knows which way the flock is going. They're all acting, independently. They have some boundaries, like rules, like don't run into each other, try and maintain a certain distance, try and fly in the same direction as the birds next to you. But there's no bird controlling it. And increasingly, our organizations are acting and behaving like that. So as a result, as organizations demonstrate more of these emerging properties and complexity becomes a dominant factor within them, we see that cost and risk also grow exponentially with that complexity. At the same time, the value that we get from additional risk also diminishes. So if I think about my control room in a plant over a process. When I added my first alarm, I added a lot of value, right? I had something that would tell an operator when something was going wrong. When I added my 10th alarm, I still was getting quite a bit of value. Now I could be more specific about what the problem was. But by the time I'm adding my 150th alarm, I'm not adding a whole lot of more value here for the operator. And in fact, I may be causing complexity. In fact, if you think back to an incident like 3 Mile Island, that was one of the key findings was there were too many alarms for the operators to understand what was going on. So they'd actually, by adding more and more alarms, had made the system so complex that it wasn't helpful anymore. And increasingly, companies are out here on this threshold where additional complexity is just adding less value. Unfortunately, for most leaders, the reaction and the response to the problems of complexity are to add more. What happens if we think of the traditional supervisor in an operation who was responsible for a particular part of the process and some equipment that was used in that process, and the people who executed that process, his or her job was to know those people, that process and equipment, and make sure that they function the way they're supposed to. But over time, we had some complexity. We had some additional some reports for him to do, some data to collect, and he gets distracted, and eventually, execution isn't as good as it used to be, and we lose control of the process, and then we have some type of an event, a safety event, a quality event, a productivity event, and as a result, what do? Well, we got to do some more reports. We need to add a new process, a new system, maybe a new organization, and what have we done? We've just added more complexity. And so We call that the vicious complexity cycle, and find that most organizations today are trapped in this cycle. As a result, we're seeing that catastrophic failures are becoming more and more frequent and more severe. Just think of some recent examples. We had a safety incident in 2008, Imperial Sugar Refinery. I believe 15 people killed, 42 injured. The 2008 housing financial collapse was an example of a system that became too complex and people didn't understand it, and so we had great financial disaster. Companies like Lehman Brothers going out of business because they didn't understand the complexity. The Deepwater Horizon oil spill, the worst environmental disaster in history, very complex operation, joint venture, all kinds of things adding complexity that caused that to happen. The Fukushima Daiichi disaster, nuclear reactor plant that we put on the coast of a small island where there could be large waves that cause a disaster. The West Fertilizer plant, we built up a town around a little fertilizer plant without understanding the risk that we were adding by doing that. And then, another one, just a quality impact, the Takata airbag recall, an extremely complex supply chain that has now resulted in, billions, I think last count I saw was $45 billion worth of recalls, and not to mention the more than a dozen known deaths that are part of the tragedy. So you see these events, they impact not just safety, they can be financial, they can be quality, customer related, environmental, but they're all increasing and becoming larger. And the issue is that our traditional approach to managing complexity doesn't account for these kinds of events well, because they're too complex to anticipate. All the things that work together to make that happen were too complex for us to understand. They happen too fast to address. As we mentioned, complex systems have feedback loops, and so things can evolve and change very quickly. And then finally, the specific combination of events that are adding up together to cause these failures are too infrequent to understand, right? It's some combination of hundreds of individual events all leading up to this. So even our root cause analysis isn't helpful in preventing the next failure. So many people have just kind of resigned themselves to the fact that this is the new reality. The world's more complex. Things are bad things are going to happen, and we just need to accept and understand that. And that's the way it has to be. At Wilson Paramount Company, we don't believe that's the case. We believe that if you look out there, there are a few what we'll refer to as high reliability organizations that defy this pessimistic view. And these are, when we use the term high reliability organization, we're talking about organizations that not just survive, but thrive and have demonstrated sustained superior performance in highly complex, high-risk environments. And the nuclear submarine force is a U.S. Navy nuclear submarine force is an excellent example of a high reliability organization. If you're not familiar, over the last 50 years, they've operated more than 150 mobile nuclear reactors, which is the equivalent of 6,000 plus years of reactor plant operation. And they operate those mobile nuclear reactors in a very remote environment, dynamic environment, underwater at speeds, with crew age around 22 years old, and they change that entire crew over every 3 years. So an extraordinarily complex environment, yet over that 6,000 years of reactor plant operation, they've never had a nuclear accident, which meaning they've never had an accident, a release of radioactivity that harmed a person or the environment. And that's just an extraordinary record when you compare it to shore-based reactors or the Soviet nuclear submarine force, which has had 4 major accidents that resulted in fatalities, or other nations that have nuclear submarine forces. And if we ask ourselves, well, what is it about the Navy that, the nuclear Navy and the submarine force that makes them so good and makes them able to thrive in that complex environment? Well, one of the things they recognize is that as we go do this, launch a submarine with a reactor on it, a mobile nuclear reactor, we're going to have really great equipment. But no matter how much energy and investment we put in our equipment, uh, we're gonna miss some things. And so, we have to also invest in our procedures, and we have to have really good, rigorous procedures. But we're gonna have times where we forget about things in our procedures, and so therefore, we need to have a culture that will identify problems, quickly solve those problems, and then help others, learn from the problems that we've identified. And so culture really becomes this last layer of defense. And so I think many organizations we find are in a similar place where they've spent a ton of money on designing the right equipment, and they've spent a ton of money on designing the right processes and procedures. But they're just still not getting the results they want. And if you find yourself in that place, that last layer of defense, culture, is probably where you need to spend some time. So let's talk about what that culture means. If you think about what a traditional military culture is, traditional military culture was, hey, follow orders, do what you're told, don't ask questions, don't question your superiors. I think we've all, seen that or familiar with that. And frankly, in a simple environment, that can work, and it can work pretty well if you have a leader who really knows how things should be, and people, do what that leader tells them to do. But in a complex environment, that won't work. And so in the Navy, when Admiral Rickover was starting up the nuclear program, he said, "Hey, I need to have operators that have a higher level of understanding. I need to have operators that follow procedures, but they also question those procedures, and when things don't seem right, they also need to back each other up, and they need to do all of that with integrity." And so, these characteristics, and I'll describe them in a little bit more detail, but we see not just in the nuclear Navy, but we see them in all high-performing organizations. You see that these things are present, or certainly organizations that are high-performing in complex environments. So the first one is level of knowledge, and that's the principle that it's not okay for an operator or an employee to just do something because they're told to do something. They need to understand why they're doing what they're doing. They need to understand why they're pushing the button. They don't push it just because the procedure said push it. They know what it does, why they're doing it, how it impacts things upstream and downstream, and all the risks associated with it. At the same time, there is a degree of formality, and that means that there's a way we do things around here. We don't get to just make it up. There's a best way to do things. We identify that best way, and we're expected to follow that best way. At the same time, we practice a questioning attitude. So even though we know there's a way we do things, we're also constantly questioning, is it still the right way? Because what was the right way yesterday may not be today. And then we also have to back each other up. So we know that, hey, especially in a complex environment, I mean, we're all human. We make mistakes. We're going to fail from time to time. We need other people to be watching out for us so that when we do make a mistake, they can back us up and stop us from failing. And then finally, we obviously have to have integrity in a complex environment, right? If we can't trust each other to do what we say and to say what we've done, then we're kind of doomed from the get-go before we even start. And what's really unique is that about these 5 characteristics is that they all work together. I mean, if you think about how do you balance some of these, and many times we go into an organization and they're talking about, hey, we need to get operational discipline. So everybody needs to follow procedures. And then what we see is, an incident occurs, and the employee says, well, I was just following procedures, right? Just doing what I was told. So, really is, well, you have to have a level of knowledge to before you follow the procedure. You also need to question the procedure. But if, I don't even have procedures and nobody follows them, it's kind of hard for me to question things that are out of the ordinary because everything's out of the ordinary. So, all 5 of these really work together. So I'm just going to pause there for a minute. I've got a few polling questions that I'd like to present to present to you all and get your feedback on. So the first one here is should be showing on your screen. Is creating a culture that leads to excellence a priority for your organization? Do you think that, your organization needs to create a culture that is like the one we've kind of described here in the Navy, where people follow procedures but question things out of the ordinary, back each other up, etc.? Okay. All right. Great. So it looks like everybody agrees. I'll show you just a unanimous vote there that yes, we all think that's important. So next question I would ask you is, you know, do you believe that organizational culture is something that can be managed? Can you deliberately manage organizational culture? Okay, great. Again, looks like we have a unanimous vote there as well. That yes, it can be deliberately managed, and that's certainly something that we would agree with. So, final question is, how does your organization do at it? I mean, do you think that leaders in your company know how to manage culture? Is it an improvement opportunity, or, frankly, we, don't really have an idea of what we're doing? Okay. Fantastic. So it looks like at least everybody says, hey, there's some opportunity to improve. So great. Appreciate your participation in that. So let's talk about that then. What does it take to change culture? So we all agree that it can be deliberately managed. But how do you do that? How do you deliberately manage culture? So let me start out by just sharing a basic framework that we use to think about culture, because when you talk about complexity, I think people often make this way more complicated or complex than it needs to be. Uh, at the very basic level, culture is the beliefs that a group of people share about what's important, how things work, how things should be done, and the way that things are. And those beliefs influence their behaviors on a day-to-day basis. So let me give you an example. If I believe that it's okay to take shortcuts, and then I am confronted with a situation where I'm under time pressure and constraints, I'll take a shortcut. That's my behavior. And all of our behaviors are result in consequences. So if maybe I take the shortcut, I get the job done faster than I expected, and I get a reward from my boss, pats me on the back, and nothing bad happened to me. Well, my consequence then is going to reinforce my belief that it's okay to take shortcuts. On the other hand, if I took the shortcut and maybe I got in trouble for taking a shortcut, or some bad event happened, then that consequence would undermine my belief that it's okay to take shortcuts. So, if culture is those beliefs, and that's how culture is formed over time, that gives us some insights into how do we change that? How do we affect this cycle? The first challenge is that, well, as leaders, we can't force anybody to believe something. We can tell them what we'd like them to believe, but we cannot force them to do it. At the same time, we also can't tell anybody how to behave. We can tell them how we would like them to behave, but at the end of the day, we're all humans and we have free will, and we'll behave how we want to behave. So what we can change as leaders are the rewards, the consequences. And I'm not just talking about formal rewards here. I'm talking about informal rewards as well. They're often much more powerful and an influence. So for instance, if I tell people that I want them to report problems and report issues, but then every time the process for reporting a problem or issue requires somebody to fill out a 5-page report in triplicate and then go through a painful investigation, well, clearly that is going to, disincentivize them. That's a consequence that says, we don't really want you to report problems. And so this is one of the things where most organizations fail. They think changing culture means let's talk about what beliefs and behaviors we want, and we'll put those on the wall. but they don't change the systems of rewards. They don't change the consequences for people's behaviors, and as a result, there's no real change. If you think about, you look at this image here, it's a perfect example. We have a sign that says no fishing, yet, obviously you see a lot of people fishing, right? And because nobody has, no consequences for their actions. So let's talk about some steps then for driving sustainable culture change. The first one I'll share with you is that you need to define the culture in terms of a few behaviors. So, if you say I want to have we want to create a culture that leads to excellence, the first step is to define what that culture is. If you don't define it, you can't change to it. And, I think this is the one place where many organizations just fall down. They never even start by doing that. The other issue is that they don't do it in a few behaviors. They might do it in many. I've seen one organization that tried to define safety culture as a list of 200 things. Well, that's just not going to be very helpful for people, right? Operators aren't going to remember 200 things. Nobody's going to remember 200 things. So you need to really boil it down to, what are the 5, 6, 7, maybe 10 at the most, guiding principles or behaviors that define the culture that we're trying to make. And also, I'll emphasize that these should be like that, principles or behaviors, and not just values. So using the safety example, many people will say, well, safety, be safe. But that doesn't really give anybody, what does that mean, be safe? I think I'm being safe. At least I thought I was being safe until I got hurt, right? So you need to boil it down to things like formality. There's a way we do things around here. Questioning attitude, question things that are out of the ordinary, back each other up. Those are specific things that are helpful to people. The second thing you need to do is communicate a case for change. At the end of the day, you have to get leaders that are bought into leading this change. And when I say bought in and committed, I mean committed like the pig, not the chicken. Is committed to breakfast, right? The chicken donated an egg. As many leaders donate some time, some budget. They'll talk about it, use the talking points, but they don't internalize what the change is, kind of like the pig does. So you need to have a case for change and a very deliberate way to manage that with your leaders and help them understand why this is important. The third step is to translate the behaviors you want to all levels of the organization to help them understand them. This is an example of how we helped a client do that, where we helped the maintenance, help them translate the behaviors to a maintenance leader. So, if you just say, hey, we want people to follow procedures, and we say that, follow procedures, what is that? But what does that mean in my role? Following procedures for an operator looks different than it does for a maintenance planner, and different than it does for an accountant or a salesperson or a research engineer. So we need to translate those behaviors to their role and help them understand what does it mean. This is for the maintenance planner as an example, and you'll see that this company defined its target culture through these 5 behaviors, we'll call them, at the top. And then they help the maintenance planner understand, what is expected of you in terms of that behavior, and how do you fulfill those expectations? What does it look like when you're being engaged, when you're using a questioning attitude, when you're having integrity? What does that look like specifically in your role? This can be incredibly important. Give you an example. We had an organization where some of the when we asked them, do people follow procedures, some of the leaders said, oh yeah, we follow procedures all the time, and others said, no, we never follow procedures. So when we asked them, well, what does it mean to follow procedures? And some of them said, well, it means that I have a checklist and I check off what I'm supposed to do. And the other one said, well, no, it means that I do what I was trained to do, right? And those are 2 very different things. So you can understand why some thought they were following procedures and others didn't. And then finally, you need to integrate the desired culture into your systems. You need to make sure that your systems support and reward the right behaviors in order avoid the phishing example, right? Because if we just tell people how we want them to behave, but the systems still reward the old behaviors, then there will be no sustainable change. Now, this is an example of how we helped a client integrate the culture into their performance management process, where we said, hey, no longer are we just going to reward people based on results, but we're also going to reward them based on their behaviors being consistent with the desired culture. So the final thing, I guess, adding to this is those 4 steps are great, but if you're going to deliberately manage anything, as we talked about earlier, you can. One of the most important steps is being able to measure it, because if you can't measure it, you really can't measure it, as the old saying goes. So with that in mind, I got another polling question for you here. Just curious, how does put the question up here? How does your company currently measure culture? Do you do surveys, written surveys, maybe web-based surveys, any of that kind of stuff? Do you do, focus groups and interviews, personality profiles, or what? We don't measure culture. Okay. Great. So it looks like most people are doing something. Everybody's doing something, either some kind of a survey or interview or something like that. So that's good. So let's talk about a few of those different examples, because we've used those with clients as well in the past and struggled, found some issues with some of those. So the first one with the written survey, a lot of those use something like a Likert scale, where it's on a scale of 1 to 5. Sometimes, always, never do we follow procedures, for instance. The challenge that we found with that kind of a survey is that either people seem to either put a 1 or a 5, or they seem reluctant to put a 1 or a 5, and so everything ends up a 2, 3, or a 4. And then on top of that, we're not really sure, well, what does it mean? So if I have a 3.8 on follow procedures, is that good? How much better is a 3.8 than a 3.6 or a 3.4? It's very relative. And then the other thing is that it doesn't force any differentiation. We often see in a survey where the term, do people follow procedures, is a 3.6, and then do people tolerate shortcuts as a 3.5, and you say, well, how can that be? So that's one of the challenges with those kinds of surveys. With interviews you can actually get some really tremendous insights and data from, but we often find that senior leaders aren't really willing to buy in. There's some distrust for those interviews. We'll often hear things like, well, who did you ask? And, how did you ask them? And did they really say that? And, they're reluctant to take action without the quantified data to support the surveys. And then the final thing you'll see in a lot of organizations are what we'll call personality profiles or engagement surveys. Like, are you happy working here? Do you like your working conditions? And the problem there is that's not really a survey about culture. That's a survey about your satisfaction. Do you like your job? And you don't have to necessarily like your job to follow procedures, right? There's plenty of operators in nuclear control rooms on submarines that have been at sea for 6 months that aren't happy with their job, but they still follow procedures because they know it's important. So one of the things Wilson Paramount Company did, we set out to, when we're working with our clients and experiencing some of those issues, we said there's got to be a better way to do this. There's got to be a better way to evaluate culture and measure culture. And so we set out to improve upon that. And in that journey, we developed a Yardstick. And Yardstick is a web-based tool that allows organizations to assess their culture and benchmark it against high reliability organizations. We take a fundamentally different approach. So let me just briefly show you what Yardstick looks like in practice. So this is Yardstick. As I mentioned, it's a web-based program that allows organizations to assess their culture. And what you'll see, notice on the screen here, is that the tool consists of 40 different statements. 40 statements that could potentially describe an organizational culture. So things like walk the talk, seek personal success, cover the mistakes of others, etc. And then what you'll notice is these 7 numbers over here to the side, but you also notice these buckets up here at the top that you can see up here. And the way this works is a person using the tool will select a number, and you'll see that the buckets begin to fill up. And when it goes too high, whoops, now I can't do that. I have to move something to another bucket. So what this forces me to do is select 3 of these 40 statements to say this is most like our organization, 3 that are least like our organization, etc. And so we overcome that problem that we talked about with surveys where people are reluctant to put things in a 1 of 5 or everything's similar. The other thing this allows us to do is at the end of once the people in the organization have taken it, is we're able to say, hey, in your organization, the statement cover the mistakes of others, for instance, ranked number 10. In a good organization, in a high-performing organization, that statement ranked number 30. And that's meaningful. That's much more meaningful than, is 5.3 better than 5, or is 3.5 better than 3.2? I don't know how much better. So it allows us to really look at the data in a different way. Yardstick does this process 2 times. We ask people to rank these 40 statements based on their perceptions of the current culture, and then to repeat that based on what they think the culture should be like. So right away it allows us to give leaders some very useful data. What it helps them do is understand not just is there a gap in their culture from what you might see in a high reliability organization, but also are people even aligned on what the culture should be? Because if you're not aligned on what the culture should be, you actually need to start there, right? You can't change to something if everybody doesn't agree on what you should be changing it to. So this helps us quantify a lot of this stuff for people and understand how much alignment there is. Allows us to quantify how much alignment there is on the culture from senior leaders and down through the organization. So in this organization, you could see as we got away from the senior leadership team, there was a belief that the culture is not really what it needs to be, whereas the senior leaders felt like it was pretty close to where it needed to be. Yardstick will also help identify specific issues that are problems or maybe causing performance issues. So here you can see in this organization, the statement help others grow and develop. The operators ranked at 24 out of 40, and they said it should be number 1, whereas the senior leaders thought it already was number 1. So we can work with them to understand why is it that employees think that? Is there a problem with the training program, or is it some leader behavior that's contributing to that? What is it that's driving that perception? They both think it's important, but how close they are to where it should be is a different thing. And then finally, we've used this tool with high reliability organizations like the U.S. Nuclear Navy. So we have data from actual HROs, and we're able to show a company where their data compares. So, how do you stack up and how far is the gap? So this is an example of data from one of our oil and gas clients where we compared this data with the submarine, and you can see, hey, around questioning attitude and backing each other up, those were specific gaps, pretty sizable gaps and things that they needed to work on. Yardstick was designed, to be an easy tool, something very efficient and easy for you to use. A lot of organizations, when they start thinking about, do I need to work on culture, you start designing this great big project. We like to think of Yardstick like, when you go to the doctor, the first thing you do is take your temperature and your blood pressure, and hey, if you're healthy, you're healthy, right? We don't need to go do a big study, a whole bunch of diagnosis on whether or not, run MRIs and stuff on, do you have some complex disease? Because the signs are good. And so it really allows us to do the same thing. So as a result, it's very cost effective, typically $10 to $25 per participant. And of course, it depends on the size of your organization, how you want to view the data, how you want to slice and dice the data. But generally, that's a good range that project can be done in. Next, it's fast. 15 to 20 minutes per respondent. Very simple. It's a pretty straightforward thing for them to do. They can use it on any device. You can use it on a computer, a tablet, an iPhone. We've made it as flexible as possible so people can do it whenever or wherever they're at. And then finally, the process is very simple. It's fully automated. Typically, if somebody wants to use Yardstick, we just ask them to assign a coordinator within the company that we can communicate with. We customize the demographic data that you want. So if you want to know by role or tenure or region or whatever, we can gather that data. We customize the communications, so that the emails, the welcome emails and stuff, the instructions that participants will see. So we have templates. We just ask, hey, does this work for you? Then we upload the participants that you want to take the assessment. And then we just sit back and relax while everybody does that, right? And give them a week or two. And then we run the data and we analyze it for you and provide you a report with our observations and recommendations about how you can improve, and some specific things you might want to look at in order to create a culture that leads to excellence. So let me close just with a quick case study. A lot of times I know leaders are looking for opportunities to create a high return on investment and really improve performance. And investments in assets and technology, those can be expensive and they can take a long time to show results, right? Sometimes it could take a year or more to from the time you're making an investment, to having the equipment installed and capturing the benefits. Similar with process improvement things. But culture can have a very high return on investment, and it can also be, contrary to popular belief, you can begin capturing those benefits relatively quickly. This is an example of one of our clients who is a mid-continent refiner of oil. They have 5 refineries. They said to us, hey, we've invested a ton of money in equipment, we've invested a ton of money in procedures, and we're still having lots of safety incidents, we're still having lots of reliability, it's costing us lots of money. We think the problem is culture. So we did an assessment for them. We identified that culture is the issue. We used those 4 steps we talked about earlier to help them define the culture they wanted, create a plan for communicating a case for change and what the behaviors they wanted were, and then to integrate it into their management systems. And within a year, they said in their annual report that they had seen a 5% year-over-year improvement in asset utilization, which resulted in a 50% improvement in lost profit, valued at $200 million in EBIT, as a result of those efforts on creating that better culture and identifying hazards sooner, and just creating a culture of operational discipline. So very sizable return for that organization on their investment within a year period. So having a detailed process, a structured process for driving culture can yield those kinds of benefits. So that kind of brings to conclusion what we wanted to share with you today. A couple things. I'll hang out. If anybody has any questions, feel free to just type them into the question or the chat box there, and I'll answer those. In the meantime, while we're doing that, a couple things that would point out to you, there should be in your toolbar there 3 handouts that you are welcome to download. One of those is a white paper that describes those 5 characteristics of cultures that lead to excellence. You'll also see a 1-page overview of Yardstick that explains how it works, and then a deck that explains it as well. And the final thing I'll just offer, waiting to see if there's any questions, is that, if you would like to set up a trial of Yardstick for, yourself and a few of your uh, team members, we're more than happy to do that so that you can see how it works and try it out. And that's something that can be done relatively quickly and painlessly. We just need probably about a 15-20 minute phone call with you to understand what information you want to collect and how to set it up. And often, even if your team, your immediate leadership team is like 10, 15 people that you want to do it with, we found that groups get quite a bit of benefit from that. They're often very surprised to see that what they all think the culture should be like is often very different. And so even just having some conversations about where they want to go, it can be a very useful tool for that. And so happy to set that up. There's a link there on the bottom that you can schedule time. So if there's no questions, then we will make sure we send a recording of this webinar out to all of you who joined us today. And we thank you for your participation and participating in the polls, and hope to hear from you in the future about how we can help you create a culture that leads to excellence on your team. So thank you.